A philosopher, a scientist, and a political leader. They were born just over a decade apart between 1906 and 1917 on 3 different continents. To the best of my knowledge, they never met, nor did they ever correspond. They came of age in the 1930s, one exiled from Nazi Germany, one forced by the Great Depression to abandon advanced study, one left to navigate a mother's illness with a father in and out of jail for anti-colonial struggle. After the war, each of them confronted, with uncommon insight, the cluster of changes that in retrospect we have called the Great Acceleration. By the end of the 1950s, a mass of data demonstrated how thoroughly human activity had affected forests and rivers, the oceans and the atmosphere. But how should societies respond? What did environmental change imply for the pursuit of justice? 3 remarkable women reflected on how to navigate, morally and politically, a transformation in human life. German-born American Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, 1906 to 1975, American marine biologist and science writer Rachel Carson, 1907 to 1964, and Indian politician Indira Gandhi, 1917 to 1984, who served for almost 16 years as Prime Minister. As Hannah Arendt was revising a set of lectures that would be published in 1958 as The Human Condition, the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1 orbited Earth. Arendt saw this as a pivot in human history more fundamental than the splitting of the atom. She perceived that the public response to spaceflight was not pride or awe at the tremendousness of human power and mastery in an era of post-war optimism. Rather, Arendt detected a sense of relief at the prospect of a step toward escape from men's imprisonment to the earth, as an American news article had put it. Arendt elucidated the dilemma. The earth is the very quintessence of the human condition, she wrote, and earthly nature, for all we know, may be unique in the universe in providing human beings with a habitat in which they can move and breathe without effort and without artifice. First in science fiction, which Arendt disdained as always disreputable, and now in popular consciousness, that earthbound fate felt like imprisonment. The quest to reach outer space shared something with the fight to extend the human lifespan. Both expressed a sense of rebellion against human existence, as it has been given. The prospect that now beckoned was cutting the last tie through which even man belongs among the children of nature. Arendt had fled Nazi Germany in 1933, moving first to London and then to New York. She remained steeped in a Western view of the world and never thought to ask who sought this freedom from planetary boundaries. Did that dream extend to those dispossessed and colonized, for whom life on Earth had not yet delivered its promise of the freedom to move and breathe without effort? Was the anti-colonial struggle not itself a rebellion against human existence as it has been given? In The Origins of Totalitarianism, the brilliant refugee philosopher located the roots of Nazi and Stalinist terror in the destabilizing churn of industrial capitalism. The monstrous violence of 20th century totalitarianism, she believed, had been presaged by the new imperialism of the 1880s and 1890s, most starkly in the genocidal thrust of German colonialism in Africa. Now, in The Human Condition, Arendt grappled with the prospect that technology would bring about an unmooring still more fundamental, an unshackling of people from their only habitable planet. Arendt's paradox was this: by breaking the limits of human existence as it has been given, technological change now threatened the boundaries which protected the world, the human artifice, from nature. What might have appeared a decisive victory in this battle, the final human liberation from earthly nature, was anything but that in Arendt's view. As technology broke one after another of the natural boundaries, creating life in the laboratory, deferring death, destroying disease, making land where there was none, breaking free of the earth itself, the life sciences, unleashed, could now see human beings as an animal species like any other. Arendt feared self-destructive growth. She observed that a wasteful consumer culture had led Americans to consume, devour, as it were, our houses and furniture and cars. Underlying this was a deeper fear that runaway population growth menaced what was most precious in human culture. Arendt, who was mostly uninterested in the Third World, could not see that this liberation of the life process had, by reducing premature death, made possible simple and precious gains for millions of people. What Arendt described as cutting the last tie, Rachel Carson understood as hubris, a path of conquest. Carson, who, as a farm girl in Pennsylvania, had written, "Wild creatures are my friends," completed a master's degree in zoology at Johns Hopkins in 1932, but family hardship during the Depression stopped her from pursuing a doctorate as she had hoped. Carson's literary talent found an outlet scripting public information radio broadcasts for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, where she was then promoted to the role of aquatic biologist. With a lyrical prose style and an eye for close observation, Carson captivated a wide audience with her love of marine life. In 1937, The Atlantic Monthly published Carson's essay, Undersea, which grew into her first book, Under the Sea Wind, in 1941. Carson evoked for her readers the whole evolutionary life of the ocean, in which the lifespan of a particular plant or animal appears, not as a drama complete in itself, but only as a brief interlude in a panorama of endless change. Her 1951 follow-up, The Sea Around Us, was a commercial and critical success that inspired an Oscar-winning documentary. The breakthrough gave Carson the financial security to write full-time. By now, Carson, like Arendt, was aware that technological change rendered the world unrecognizable. Carson became concerned with the lasting effects of chemical pesticides, and she was indefatigable in pursuit of the story. Her archive is full of letters she wrote to and received from scientists, naturalists, government officials, and citizens groups across the United States. Carson solicited copies of scientific papers. She collated testimony and observation. She pursued elusive data. She described her achievement modestly to New Yorker editor William Shawn. "What I shall now be able to achieve is a synthesis of widely scattered facts that have not heretofore been considered in relation to each other." She told him in 1959 that she had enough material to build up, step by step, a really damning case against the use of these chemicals as they are now inflicted upon us. And what she found was terrifying. The following year, Carson was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. She was determined to complete the work. Serialized in 3 issues of The New Yorker in June 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring would become the most influential environmental writing of the 20th century. Her message was clear, and clearly at odds with the governing values of the post-war decades. The control of nature, she wrote, is a phrase conceived in arrogance. Silent Spring begins with a parable of a settler idyll gone wrong. There was once a town in the heart of America, where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. The silence of the title echoes throughout the book. The sudden silencing of the song of the birds was the true sign, the true cost of the mass spraying of chemical pesticides to boost agricultural production. Carson was unequivocal. What was happening was a war against nature, an act of supreme violence. She believed that this war had already caused irrevocable and irreparable harm. In her research notes, Carson had typed up a quotation from an Alfred Etter of East Lansing, Michigan, who wrote in the Audubon magazine, "I have little doubt that by raining death upon a country of defenseless and unsuspecting living things, we have committed a crime. And by taking the lives of creatures who have no rights," Etter believed, "I know that it decreases my small freedoms even further." Carson attached to the quotation a handwritten note on a page torn from a spiral notebook. Chapter 4, Mass Spraying Becoming More and More Prevalent, Using Aerial Application. All of life lay open to the assault, and in the end the harm reverberated back to human bodies. For the first time in the history of the world, Carson wrote, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. Carson was prescient to see that the change was at once microscopic and planetary. There is also an ecology of the world within our bodies, she wrote. Carson was attentive to new ways of conceiving of the relationship between bodies and their environments made possible by rapid advances in molecular biology. Following James Watson and Francis Crick's discovery of the double helical structure of DNA in 1953. Carson feared that the insidious effects of chemical saturation would include the most basic functions of every living cell. Silent Spring ends with an image borrowed from Robert Frost of forking paths. The path humanity was on resembled a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. Just a few years after the Federal Highway Act, it was an apt metaphor. The road not taken, she insisted, writing less than 20 years after the end of the Second World War, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of our Earth. Beneath Carson's language of rapture, her counsel was technocratic. It lay in harnessing expertise in the use of biological rather than chemical methods of insect control for the selective use of natural processes to push ecosystems more gently toward human convenience. Carson knew that by launching a double attack on chemical corporations and on US government agencies, she would be taking on formidable opponents. She did not flinch. In the margins of a New York Times cutting asking who benefited from the continued expansion of US agricultural production was Carson's penciled query, Chem Industries stake? Throughout Silent Spring, Carson named the vested interests lined up behind assaults upon the environment. Their response, which followed immediately upon Silent Spring's publication, was vicious and misogynistic. Why is a spinster with no children so concerned with genetics? A former US Secretary of Agriculture demanded. Reviewers sought to discredit Carson's authority because she was a woman. They called her book hysterically over-emphatic and more emotional than accurate. Others labelled Carson a communist, which proved a cheap way to cast suspicion on her amid an atmosphere of Cold War paranoia. Chemical industry spokesman Robert White Stevens pulled out the argument that would recur in every subsequent effort to discredit environmentalists the world over. Heed Carson's plea for environmental precaution, he warned, and we would return to the Dark Ages. Carson did not back down from confronting powerful people, but her field of vision was almost entirely limited to the United States. Silent Spring insisted that the widespread dispersal of chemical pesticides was unnecessary at a time when the problem facing US agriculture was not dearth, but excess. Carson's view of US agricultural surplus did not extend to an interest in how those surpluses were used as a tool to fight the Cold War through the Food for Peace scheme under Public Law 480, which distributed America's agricultural bounty to the post-colonial world with many strings attached. Only in situations of extreme poverty and deprivation, Carson noted, would chemical control of some sort be justified. Her implication was that such situations were exceptional. For most of the world, they were not. Most of the world faced persistent hunger and a permanent struggle against an omnipresent death, noted Martinician psychiatrist and anti-colonial activist Frantz Fanon. The same blind spot led Carson toward a one-dimensional view of the use of DDT in public health. Carson was convinced that resistance to DDT was widespread among insects. In her view, this, along with the lasting toxicity of the substance, was reason enough to discontinue its use. There was no shortage of evidence that Carson could turn to. Both in public and in private, the World Health Organization, WHO, worried that the fate of its global program to eradicate malaria, a project almost entirely dependent on spraying the walls of people's homes with DDT, faced the imminent threat of insecticide resistance. As early as 1952, following a few years of well-publicized success, public health officials in Greece reported that first houseflies and then malarial mosquitoes had evolved to dodge DDT. In Carson's view, this should have been a warning to slow down. The WHO drew the opposite lesson. To heed the warning from Greece, said Emilia Pampana, Venezuelan malariologist, meant that eradication was now a race against time. In 1955, Pampana called for huge areas to be sprayed with DDT. He demanded total coverage and great thoroughness of control. His insistence was driven by moral purpose as strongly as was Carson's opposition. In a 1961 exchange of letters with Carson, the Canadian Marshall Laird, head of environmental biology at the WHO's Division of Environmental Sanitation, pointed out, without condescension, that she was not wrong to be concerned about DDT, but that she should also consider what its use had achieved. Laird shared Carson's enthusiasm for naturalistic methods. He said, but noted that the whole question of scientifically manipulating biological equilibria to best advantage was fraught and would require no less intensive an engineering of nature than chemical control. Laird emphasized the tremendous savings of human life and foodstuffs for which the synthetic insecticides have already been responsible. Millions fewer people suffered from malaria, he noted. The fearsome wartime killer, typhus, had more or less disappeared because insecticides had eliminated the fleas that transmitted it. Both feats would not have been possible without chemical compounds. Carson's concern for the natural world was always part and parcel of her deeply felt concern for human well-being. But other, more misanthropic American writers fretted that the very success of malaria eradication would prove self-defeating. By saving lives, they insisted, the scheme had sped up overpopulation in the Third World. On human numbers, the views of Carson and Arendt, otherwise so different in their diagnosis of the condition of the world, converged. Twice in her notes for Silent Spring, once copied by hand and the other time typed neatly, Carson highlighted a quotation from the Yale biologist and ecologist Paul Sears, who had written in The Steady State that violence toward nature is no less an evil than violence toward man. Sears then noted, I am far less interested in guessing how thickly mankind can be amassed on this planet than I am in the optimum quality of existence for those who inhabit it. What Sears did not see, what Carson and Arendt didn't see, was that the two processes could be the same. The amassing of people on the planet was the outcome of a modest, creeping, never-sufficient improvement in the quality of existence for millions of people in the Third World, who were now more likely to survive to adulthood. Neither Arendt nor Carson ever had to deal with the messy compromises of governing. When Indira Gandhi became Prime Minister of India in 1966, after the sudden death of the incumbent Lal Bahadur Shastri, she was thrust straight into a crisis that affected the lives of hundreds of millions of Indians. For 2 successive years, in 1965 and 1966, stretches of India waited for rain. How helplessly we are at the mercy of the elements, a Times of India editorial lamented in 1965. Arguing that all India had to show for the previous decade of development efforts were some shallow and tentative improvements in irrigation. When the summer monsoon failed for a second successive year in 1966, India's food situation became critical. The Indian government dismissed early reports of starvation from Bihar as hyperbole, just as the British imperial government used to do. So much had the Indian government staked its legitimacy on the conquest of a dark colonial history of starvation that it fought to deny that famine could be also a post-independence fact. Bihar's suffering deepened and would not be silenced. Pictures of starving people appeared in newspapers across the country and around the world. On April 20th, 1967, the government of India declared the existence of famine for the first time since independence, and did so in Palamau and Hazaribagh districts. 5 more districts were added after that. The colonial famine codes of the 19th century, revised incrementally over the years, moved into action. PL 480 grain shipments from the United States arrived in bulk and were distributed to people by a network of 20,000 fair price shops. The government initiated public works to employ local people, augmenting incomes enough to encourage food imports from other regions of India. Under the leadership of the Gandhian socialist Jayaprakash Narayan, the Bihar Central Relief Committee mobilized a legion of volunteers. Despite severe shortages, the death toll was in the thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. The Indian government had stepped in to prevent widespread starvation with the aid of the US farm surpluses that Rachel Carson had decried. The contrast with India's experience of famine under colonial rule was telling. Success came at a price. For a post-colonial state that had struggled in vain for self-sufficiency in food, India's stark reliance on US aid at a time of crisis was humiliating. I don't ever want us to beg for food again, Indira Gandhi said. As it turned out, she would not need to. Even before Indira Gandhi came to power, India's Agriculture Minister Chidambaram Subramaniam was stunned by the results shown by Rockefeller Foundation-sponsored experiments in Mexico, with high-yielding varieties of maize and wheat, and by concurrent trials with specially bred strains of rice in Taiwan and the Philippines. A team of scientists led by the Canadian plant pathologist R. Glenn Anderson launched a series of experimental stations in India with pilot projects in Delhi, Ludhiana, Pusa and Kanpur, with seeds flown in from Mexico. Here lay the roots of what would come to be known as the Green Revolution, which would recast Indian and global agriculture in the final third of the 20th century. With the food crisis, the condition of India's soils, forests and waters were catapulted to the forefront of Indira Gandhi's concerns. Her view of them was imbued with a love of nature that, like Carson's, had origins in childhood. As a girl, Indira was constantly on the move. Her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, rose to the first rank of India's anti-colonial leaders, while her mother, Kamala, ailed from tuberculosis and spent long periods of convalescence in sanatoria. Indira was educated in Geneva and Pune, and then at Santiniketan, Rabindranath Tagore's university devoted to the arts and to outdoor education. Works of natural history lined the household's bookshelves, among them American botanist Donald Culross Petey's Flowering Earth and The Faber Book of Insects. Indira developed a love of birdwatching while she was imprisoned during the Quit India movement of 1942-43, when Mahatma Gandhi spearheaded massive protests against India's forced incorporation into Britain's war effort. Her prison companion was The Book of Indian Birds by Salim Ali, a German-trained ornithologist and leading figure in the Bombay Natural History Society. The two forged a lifelong friendship. In 1950, Indira became one of the founding members of the Delhi Birdwatching Society, convened by the Quaker supporter of Indian freedom, Horace Alexander. Even as the Indian National Congress was consumed by factional strife after a poor showing in the 1967 elections, Indira Gandhi held on to her concern for nature. At a convocation speech at Bangalore University that year, she told students that our building zeal is not accompanied by respect for the needs of conservation. And she warned that India would ultimately suffer from this neglect. Indira Gandhi implemented stepwise policies of environmental protection. She surrounded herself with sycophants but remained open to the advice of scientists. In 1969, on the advice of both Indian and foreign proponents of animal protection, Indira Gandhi's government banned the export of tiger skins despite the much-needed foreign exchange that came in from their sale. The ban came as her government took a populist turn, appealing directly to voters over the heads of regional party leaders. There was little public concern about tiger hunting, but the ban was justified as part of an all-out attack on special interests that would also lead Indira Gandhi's government to nationalize the banks and the coal industry. It would not have escaped notice that those who profited from the fur trade were often from former princely families who epitomized unearned privilege. A generation after independence, many Indians had grown impatient waiting for freedom's promises to be delivered. To most observers, the scale of unmet needs and frustrated expectations in India rendered environmental protection a distant concern. One of the first to challenge this view was physicist and industrialist Vikram Sarabhai, chair of India's Atomic Energy Commission and pioneer of its space research program. In a 1970 speech at the Atomic Research Site at Trombay, Sarabhai noted that most of India's leaders still believed that the problem of human environment was largely an affliction of the industrially developed, and that since India was still quite remote from this problem, we could tackle it in its own time. But Sarabhai insisted that the ecology of the environment and the welfare of the human being are intimately connected, and that this interdependence puts on the whole problem of environmental protection a new dimension. He stressed, as Rachel Carson had done, the cumulative and irreversible character of environmental harm. Sarabhai formed part of Indira Gandhi's inner circle of scientific advisors. The same year, Indira Gandhi addressed another dimension of environmental harm at a meeting of the Non-Aligned Movement in Lusaka, Zambia, that it was a threat to peace and freedom. Established in 1961 by Nehru, Nasser, Sukarno, Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, and the Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito, The group of non-aligned countries fought to steer their own path through a Cold War world divided into US and Soviet alliances. They sought solidarity in a shared quest to give to our people a better life and the opportunity to live in freedom, in dignity, and in peace. As Indira Gandhi put it in Lusaka. Addressing her peers, she highlighted what she saw as the biggest threats to the world in 1970. In addition to the ever-present nuclear balance of terror, she added that the war in Vietnam is said to be waged with conventional weapons, yet these include chemical contamination of food and plant life. Martin Luther King Jr. had remarked on this a few years earlier in his April 1967 speech at Riverside Church, New York City, condemning the American war in Vietnam. King enumerated acts of environmental destruction in pursuit of the war. The Vietnamese, he said, faced repeated horrors as we poison their water, as we kill 1 million acres of their crops. They must weep as the bulldozers roar through their areas preparing to destroy the precious trees. By 1970, the US military had spent 9 years raining chemical defoliants upon Vietnam's forests in an escalating and failing war, fought in a doomed attempt to deny Ho Chi Minh's forces the cover of the jungle they used as shelter and camouflage, and so to prevent a prominent domino from falling to communism. In a far-fetched, if revealing, analogy with the everyday use of pesticides on American farms, military planners called it Operation Ranch Hand. Their arsenal was made up of the rainbow herbicides, each named for the color of the bands that secured the containers they were carried in. Agent Green, Agent Pink, Agent Purple, Agent Blue, as if they were characters in a children's comic book. Most of all, the US military used Agent Orange, more than 11 million gallons of it. Agent Orange contained dioxin, the most toxic substance ever produced in a laboratory. Vietnamese came to know it as Chat Doc Da Cam, orange-coloured poison. It fell from the sky, dispensed from specially tailored C-123 cargo aircraft. Ngo Look, who was serving in a guerrilla unit in Vietnam's Central Highlands, remembers his first encounter with the lethal spray. He saw a plane overhead one day, but it dropped no bombs. Instead, a fine yellow mist descended, covering absolutely everything. The soldiers thought little of it, for the spray even smelled good. The next day, he said, the leaves wilted, and within a week, the jungle was bald. Although the US government and chemical companies would for decades deny that they knew how toxic Agent Orange was, declassified secret files confirm the opposite. Harry Felt, Commander-in-Chief of US forces in the Pacific, left clear instructions. Vietnamese personnel will be utilized to the maximum extent possible in the handling of chemicals for the defoliant operation. And if not by Vietnamese personnel, then the chemicals were handled by enlisted US soldiers that were disproportionately likely to be from poor and minority backgrounds. Vietnamese, American, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers who handled it felt immediate effects. They suffered the agony of chloracne and peripheral neuropathy. The lasting harm suffered by Vietnamese people, cancers, diabetes, immunological disorders, carried across generations, through children still born, children born with spina bifida, children born with hidden disabilities. Dioxin pervaded the soil around US storage depots in Bien Hoa and Da Nang. It would bioaccumulate through the food chain, in the fat of animals, in the fish that formed the bulk of people's diets, and in up to 4.8 million human bodies. By the time of Indira Gandhi's speech to the non-aligned conference in Lusaka, the effects of Agent Orange were no secret. There was enough evidence of harm by February 1967 to prompt 5,000 American scientists to write an open letter denouncing what they called the chemical and biological weapons used in Vietnam. In February 1970, Yale University plant biologist Arthur Galston, speaking at a conference in Washington, described the use of Agent Orange as ecocide, a conscious allusion to genocide. He asked the US government whether any cause can legally or morally justify the deliberate destruction of the environment of one nation by another. The assault on Vietnam with defoliants was an aggressive amplification of the daily rain of death that Rachel Carson had seen and condemned on America's farms, now at 50 times the chemical concentration. Writer and translator of Vietnamese fiction Charles Waugh points out that the use of Agent Orange displayed a casualness towards dangerous chemicals, only conceivable in the context of post-war America's petrochemical-saturated culture. The war in Vietnam's forests joined Carson's worst fear with Indira Gandhi's. Ecological destruction in Vietnam inflicted lasting chemical damage to the earth and its inhabitants, and at the same time, it threatened the hard-won freedom of post-colonial countries. My motivation was the message from Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring, young Gustav Strandenais recalls. He was one among 10,000 people, mostly young, mostly white, who soaked up the carnival atmosphere at the People's Forum in Stockholm, Sweden, for 2 weeks in June 1972. The local host set aside camping space for those who could not afford hotel rooms and provided them with a supply of bicycles. The forum resounded with intense debates and theatrical humorous protests, youth dressed as ancient Greek Olympians handing out medals to the world's most polluting companies. The activists and non-governmental organizations were there to observe, protest, cheer, and advocate at the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. The conference slogan was, "Only One Earth." The summit was first proposed in 1967 by the Swedish delegation to the United Nations. By the time it was held 5 years later, the litany of ecological harm had only grown. The supertanker Torrey Canyon ran aground off the coast of Cornwall in 1967, spilling at least 25 million gallons of oil. Fish floated lifeless in the Rhine, so choked with the effluent from Europe's industrial heartland that it was declared a dead river. In January 1969, an offshore rig, operated by Union Oil, exploded off the California coast. Gas and black oil rushed to the ocean surface, escaping through cracks in the sea floor even after the rig was capped. The bottom of the ocean exploded, remembers Bob Solon, who was a Santa Barbara News Press reporter at the time. Toxic waves hit the coast of Santa Barbara, one of America's wealthiest communities, and poisoned thousands of seabirds. If Silent Spring had sparked environmental consciousness in America, the Santa Barbara disaster galvanized action. Student groups, lawyers, ecologists, local residents, and legislators came together. As a direct response to the disaster, Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson proposed a nationwide teach-in on the environment. It was held in April 1970 and would come to be known as Earth Day. In America, Earth Day forged a coalition of support from college students, peace activists, suburban women, Sierra Club conservationists, and scientists. Its impact echoed around the world. An editorial in the Times of India called it an exhilarating mass movement. The Indian journalist noted that we in this part of the world tend to be smug about these matters, but we are no less culpable. From the fissure of India's gaping inequalities crept the question of blame. The Times of India chose to blame the ignorance of the poor as much as the inaction of government. Forests are denuded for firewood. Soil is grossly overworked. There is thoughtless overuse of chemical, fertilizers, and pesticides. It was in this atmosphere of expectation that Indira Gandhi took to the podium at the Stockholm Conference. She was the only head of state to attend apart from the host, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. The conference preparations had already fallen foul of Cold War tensions. Since East Germany was not a member of the United Nations, only West Germany was invited to attend. The Soviet Union and its allied states boycotted the meeting, so its legitimacy was in question from the start. Third world countries, too, threatened not to attend. They feared with cause that environmental regulations would become just another tool for rich countries to keep them poor. It was left to the smooth-talking, well-connected Canadian oil executive and diplomat, Maurice Strong, to salvage the summit as its chair. Film footage shows Strong waiting eagerly to welcome Prime Minister Gandhi at the entrance to the Folkets Hus, where the meeting was held. Her stature and moral authority would be vital to its success. Indira Gandhi did not disappoint. Her speech to the plenary session was visionary and hopeful. Its theme was contradiction. Indira Gandhi set out the long list of ecological problems that were already of concern to her and to India. Some of our own wildlife has been wiped out. Miles of forests with beautiful old trees, mute witnesses of history, have been destroyed, she said. Indira Gandhi had a skilled team of speechwriters led by H.Y. Sharada Prasad, and in her appeal to mute witnesses of history, there is a lyrical echo of her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, who in the 1930s had written an epistolary primer of world history for Indira. She was motivated, above all, by concern for the human being, a species which is also imperiled. Indira Gandhi's diagnosis of the world's environmental crisis differed from that of many of the summit's promoters, whose vision borrowed the Malthusian fears epitomized by the views of Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich, whose book The Population Bomb was published to acclaim in 1968. Ehrlich was at the Stockholm meeting too. He spoke on many panels as the reasoned scientific voice of alarm. But when he first saw Indira Gandhi's India, Ehrlich had been anything but dispassionate. The opening lines of Ehrlich's book described a stinking hot night in Delhi, and the author's distaste for all those poor dark-skinned bodies was barely concealed. His car was not insulation enough. As we crawled through the city, we entered a crowded slum area. The streets seemed alive with people, he wrote. People eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing and screaming. People, 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 people. In response, Indira Gandhi argued environmental degradation was primarily a problem of distribution, not of numbers. She reminded her audience that, notwithstanding the conference slogan, "We inhabit a divided world," when it came to the origins of the environmental crisis, India's Prime Minister was clear about where the blame should lie. Many of the advanced countries of today have reached their present affluence by their domination over other races and countries, she said. Global economic inequality had its origins in ecological violence and theft. And so, the rich world got a head start through sheer ruthlessness, undisturbed by feelings of compassion or by abstract theories of freedom, equality, or justice. Now, poor countries were being told that they could not do the same, and they feared that the latter would be kicked away from them. The riches and the labor of the colonized countries played no small part in the industrialization and prosperity of the West, she reminded her audience. Yet the provision of dignified standards of living to India's poorest citizens now took place amid an eagle-eyed watchfulness and an awareness which she felt acutely of finite resources and of time running out. We do not wish to impoverish the environment any further, Indira Gandhi insisted, and yet we cannot for a moment forget the grim poverty of large numbers of people. Her most resonant phrase, for which her speech is still remembered, came in the form of an ambiguous question. Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? Indira Gandhi raised the stakes when she asked, how can we speak to those who live in villages and in slums about keeping the oceans, the rivers, and the air clean when their own lives are contaminated at the source? India's Prime Minister held firm to the faith of her father's generation that science and technology would provide a solution. Here lay India's great hope, and the hope of all the Third World, that there might be a less ecologically ruinous path to prosperity. The Green Revolution, well underway, offered hope. It promised to boost food production without gobbling land, leaving space for protected areas. For the last quarter of a century, Indira Gandhi concluded, we have been engaged in an enterprise unparalleled in human history, the provision of basic needs to 1/6 of mankind within the span of 1 or 2 generations. In this evocation of speed and scale, Indira Gandhi offered her own perspective on the great acceleration that was sweeping the world. Indira Gandhi's manifesto received support from many other representatives of Asian, African, and Latin American countries. Chua Shan-chin, Singapore's health minister and a former trade union lawyer, insisted that if developed countries are genuinely interested in the improvement of the overall human environment, then they must be willing to contribute resources that poorer countries lacked. After all, we all live in one world, he added, pointedly. Ghanaian diplomat K.B. Asante put it more starkly. The problems that Ghana and most African countries confronted, he said, were simple, elementary ones of biological pollution. Providing people with safe drinking water was the greatest environmental challenge for human health, and one so fundamental that it would be easy to forget amid all the talk of oil spills and industrial pollution. On the fringes of the conference at the People's Forum attended by youth and activists, Indira Gandhi's vision received support from a voluble American cellular biologist who was drawn to socialism. Barry Commoner had graced the cover of Time magazine's February 1970 issue as a prophet of a new ecological vision. At the Stockholm Conference, he did not mince his words in setting out his radical vision of environmental justice. The environmental crisis, Commoner said, cast a bright light on fundamental concerns that we've tended to push under the rug. Questions about the validity of the private enterprise system, about whether we can tolerate wars, and about enduring racial discrimination. The Third World, he said, had been victimized ecologically by colonialism. Commoner challenged the Malthusians when he noted that the population explosion was really a symptom of the last remnants of the harmful influence of colonization. For it was only now, at last, that most people on Earth were being given a chance at longer lives and broader choices. Commoner concluded his interview with the press at Stockholm with a call, years ahead of its time, for ecological reparations, which he insisted was a just idea. Indira Gandhi's speech at Stockholm conveyed a humane, multifaceted perspective, insisting that the health of the planet was vital for human flourishing. It was a more generous vision of the future than either Rachel Carson's or Hannah Arendt's. In India, it would culminate in tragedy. 2 years before Stockholm, in Lusaka, Mrs. Gandhi had announced to her fellow leaders, "The revolution of our times is unfinished." Most of her audience agreed. Post-colonial leaders felt that their political power was being eroded at every turn by economic dependence on the wealthy countries. The former colonial powers had stacked the rules of the global economy against the Third World. Ghana's leader, Kwame Nkrumah, had first used the term neocolonialism to describe a state of continued inequality after formal decolonization. Indira Gandhi embraced the idea. The brazen removal of elective governments by the CIA and former colonial intelligence agencies in Iran, in Indonesia, and, just the year after Stockholm, in Chile, gave Third World governments, especially those on the left, good reason to worry. Independent-minded governments allied to the Soviet Union viewed with the same alarm the brutal military crackdowns on democratic movements in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Almost all post-colonial leaders faced restless and divided domestic constituencies, impatient for tangible improvements to their lives. Insecure leaders shored up their power by silencing opposition. On June 25, 1975, Indira Gandhi invoked a constitutional provision intact from the colonial era to ask India's president to declare a state of emergency. The Prime Minister faced unrest, rolling industrial strikes, and a debilitating energy crisis after the price of oil spiked following the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposing an embargo on exports to the United States in retaliation for US support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The night the emergency was declared, police raided the homes of activists, opposition politicians, and journalists. Tens of thousands were detained. Mrs. Gandhi muzzled the press, shredded civil liberties. A sense of ecological emergency, of time running out, fed into a wider sense of all-pervasive crisis. Project Tiger had been launched in 1973 to protect the Bengal tiger by creating a series of 9 tiger reserves. The emergency suspension of democratic niceties allowed an emboldened forest department to enforce the program with zeal, evicting Adivasi communities from their homes. The recovery in the number of India's endangered big cats was met with international celebration among conservationists. The emergency's most brutal measures bore an ecological stamp. Despite the subtle way Indira Gandhi had articulated in Stockholm the relationship between population and ecology, she proved unable to resist the fear that population was an uncontrollable and destabilizing force, a threat to be met with violence. The Prime Minister's loutish son, Sanjay Gandhi, was unleashed in 1976 to oversee a nationwide push to sterilize poor families. The program targeted men because of the greater ease of the surgical procedure. State governments set wild targets. Local officials scrambled to meet them. Some personal rights have to be kept in abeyance, Indira announced in 1976, for the human rights of the nation, the right to life, the right to progress. In 1976 to 77 alone, 8 million Indians underwent sterilization, many of them in mass camps. They came for the incentive of cash payments and transistor radios. They came because they had been threatened with the withdrawal of ration cards and state benefits. They came packed onto the backs of trucks by local thugs, beaten and threatened and lied to. The sterilizations struck hardest at the poorest families, from the least privileged castes, and from religious minorities, Muslims above all. Countless people suffered injury because of botched operations. Tens or hundreds of thousands of bodies were violated without a shred of consent, and many people died or suffered lifelong disability. Human lives were reduced to statistical targets, their future choices reduced to the aggregate question of population control. India's rush to population control, like China's, which was to follow with the declaration of the one-child policy in 1979, in the flurry of economic reforms after Mao's death in 1976, embodied a way of thinking that pitted individual against collective rights, and saw the control of natural forces, including the size of a population, as a battle to be won. It embodied a way of thinking that measured success in large numbers and equated precaution with failure. Having posed the question, are not poverty and need the greatest polluters, Mrs. Gandhi launched an assault on the poor. The fatal flaw of Indira Gandhi's approach was one that Arendt had foreseen as a danger. The answer to how we should live on a changed earth, Arendt argued, could only be subject to the agreement of many. No one person, no one idea could decide on a path, as though we dealt here with problems for which only one solution is possible. Arendt always emphasized the plurality of human beings and human interest, even or especially when the human condition was on the threshold of such unforeseen alteration. Because of the brave advocacy of Rachel Carson, because of the work of delegates who attended the Stockholm Conference, because of a much larger number of local activists who went unheralded, countries around the world moved to pass environmental legislation. The pressure and response that joined activists, scientists, and legislators within and across borders modelled the emphasis that Arendt placed on deliberation. The list is long. The United States passed the Air Quality Act in 1967, followed by the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Clean Air Act in 1970. In 1969, Ethiopia opened the Simeon National Park in the country's northern highlands. Mexico passed the first air pollution legislation in Latin America in 1971, with President Luis Echeverría Álvarez's Ley Federal para Prevenir y Controlar la Contaminación Ambiental. India soon followed. A year before her emergency, Mrs. Gandhi's government sponsored the Water Act of 1974. It created pollution control boards at both the state and the national level. They had authority to determine permissible levels of pollution, setting limits on the composition and quantity of effluent that factories could discharge into water bodies. Countries around the world followed suit over the following decade. Indonesia passed its Act No. 4, which encompassed environmental protection in 1982. Because of the scale and pace of technological change, the cumulative effects of human activity grew uncontrollable. Arendt had used the phrase action into nature to describe the unstable ways that human activity could have irreversible consequences. The emergence of an international infrastructure for environmental policy and monitoring coincided with growing concern among scientists that human activity might already have placed the Earth on a dangerous trajectory. The World Meteorological Organization's first World Climate Conference, held in Geneva in 1979, predicted that growing concentrations of atmospheric carbon would lead surface temperatures to rise between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius by 2050, and that the problem was worrying enough to make it imperative to reduce scientific uncertainty as rapidly as possible. This is the distinctive and tragic feature of environmental politics. How quickly we went from the stirring of awareness to despair that we might be too late.